Imagine your alarm goes off at 2:30 in the morning. Not for an emergency. Not for an early flight. Not even for Black Friday shopping. But because you need 2 full hours just to get dressed. And if you're late, you don't get fired. You get executed. Welcome to the life of a Ming Dynasty court official, where every morning was a performance. Every gesture had meaning. And sleeping in wasn't a mistake. It was treason. Before we dive into this particular circle of bureaucratic hell, get comfortable. Seriously. Adjust those pillows. Pull that blanket up to your chin. Because where we're going tonight, comfort was a concept that simply did not exist. The Chinese Imperial Court operated on one fundamental principle: if something could be done simply, complicate it until it requires 12 officials, 4 hours, and a manual the size of a phone book. The gong sounded at 2:30 in the morning, echoing through the stone corridors of the Forbidden City like the world's most unwelcome alarm clock. There was no snooze button. There was no rolling over for 5 more minutes. There was only the cold realization that you had exactly 2 hours to transform yourself from a sleeping human into a perfectly dressed representative of cosmic order. And if you failed, well, let's just say performance reviews in the Ming Dynasty were significantly more permanent than modern ones. Court officials lived in chambers within or near the Forbidden City, close enough to hear that dawn gong, far enough to never quite feel at home. The sound would jolt them awake from whatever dreams they'd managed to squeeze into 4 or 5 hours of sleep. Dreams of simpler times, perhaps, of childhood homes where morning meant breakfast. Not dread, but there was no time for nostalgia. The Imperial Court waited for no one, and the sun certainly didn't care about your circadian rhythm. Within minutes, servants and eunuchs would appear, carrying lanterns that cast dancing shadows on walls painted with dragons and clouds. The officials had no choice but to rise, joints creaking, eyes burning, and begin the elaborate process of becoming presentable to an emperor they might not even see clearly from their assigned position in the hall. The dressing process was an ordeal in itself. This wasn't slipping into slacks and a button-down shirt. This was 12 layers, minimum, each one loaded with meaning, each one requiring assistance to don properly. The base layer was silk, cool against skin that still held the warmth of sleep. Then came the inner robes, the middle robes, the outer robes, each in colors strictly determined by rank. A first-rank official wore crimson, second rank, scarlet, third rank, blue. Get the shade wrong, and you'd insulted the entire cosmic hierarchy before breakfast. Then came the accessories. And this is where things got truly absurd. The court hat, stiff and formal, adorned with a button whose material indicated your exact position in the bureaucracy. Gold for the highest ranks, then silver, then various grades of semi-precious stones working down to basic copper for the lower officials. It was a ranking system you could read from across a courtyard, which was exactly the point. In the Imperial Court, your worth was always visible. The belt required its own set of servants, made of leather or fabric. It held a jade plaque in the front, again indicating rank. And from it hung various ornamental items: a purse for carrying memorials, a fan for the summer heat you'd be standing in for 6 hours, and sometimes a small knife. Though what exactly you were supposed to cut during a court session remains unclear. Perhaps your losses, metaphorically speaking. And we haven't even mentioned the shoes yet. Court shoes were embroidered silk, designed for standing still. Absolutely useless for anything requiring actual movement. They had thick soles to add height, because apparently even footwear was about hierarchy. Walk too fast, and you'd trip. Walk too slow, and you'd be late. The shoes were basically a physical reminder that your body no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the performance. As the officials dressed, eunuchs would hover nearby, checking every detail. These weren't optional fashion consultants. They were quality control inspectors whose job was to catch mistakes before the emperor's eye did. A crooked hat, a wrinkled robe, a button that caught the light wrong. Any of these could be disastrous. Not because the emperor necessarily cared about your hemline, but because sloppiness suggested disrespect, and disrespect suggested disloyalty, and disloyalty. Well, that was a problem with a very permanent solution. The eunuchs themselves were fascinating figures in this mourning ritual, neither fully male nor female in a society obsessed with gender roles. They occupied a strange space between servant and power broker. Many were more educated than the officials they dressed. Most were better informed about palace politics. All of them were watching, always watching, because information was currency. And the early morning was when guards were down and secrets slipped out. Imagine getting dressed while someone takes notes on your anxiety levels. By 3:30, if everything went smoothly, an official would be fully dressed and ready to leave his chamber. He'd grab a small lantern, because the Forbidden City at this hour was darker than your worst nightmare, and begin the walk to the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where the morning court session would take place. The walk itself was another test. The Forbidden City wasn't designed for convenience. It was designed to make you feel small, insignificant, and deeply aware of your place in the cosmic order. The courtyards stretched endlessly, each one vast enough to swallow your sense of self-importance. The buildings loomed overhead, their golden tiles invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, but their presence felt nonetheless. Other officials emerged from the shadows, moving in the same direction like a silent procession of exhausted ghosts. No one spoke. Speaking before court was considered improper. And besides, what was there to say? Another morning, another performance, another day of standing still while your back screamed, and your bladder plotted mutiny. The air was cold in winter, bitterly. So, Beijing in January is not kind. And the Forbidden City, for all its grandeur, had heating that can best be described as theoretical. Officials would arrive at the Great Hall with fingers numb, noses running, desperately trying to maintain dignified composure while their bodies rebelled against the cold. Summer was worse. Somehow, the heat would build slowly as dawn approached, and by the time court began, the stone courtyards would be radiating warmth like a barbecue pit, standing in 12 layers of silk and brocade, under a hat that trapped heat like a personal sauna. Officials would sweat through their inner robes within the first hour, but showing discomfort was showing weakness. And weakness, like everything else, was political. The Hall of Supreme Harmony rose before them as they entered the final courtyard, its yellow tiles beginning to catch the first hints of dawn. This was the heart of the empire, the throne room, where the Son of Heaven held court. And it was massive. Not cozy, massive. Not impressive, massive. But soul-crushing, ego-destroying. Remember your insignificance, massive. The building was designed to intimidate, and it succeeded brilliantly. The roof alone was a work of art, layered in yellow glazed tiles that only the emperor could use. Anyone else who dared to roof their building in Imperial yellow would find themselves roofing a much smaller structure, like a coffin. The eaves swept upward, carved with dragons and phoenixes that seemed to move in the pre-dawn light. Everything about the hall screamed power, permanence, and the absolute futility of individual ambition. Inside, the space was even more overwhelming. The ceilings soared overhead, painted in intricate patterns of clouds and dragons. The pillars were massive, lacquered in red and gold, each one carved with yet more dragons, because apparently you can never have too many reminders that the Emperor is cosmically significant, and you are not Tem. But here's the thing about the hall's design that most people don't realize. It was an acoustic marvel. A whisper from the throne could carry to the back of the room, while a shout from anywhere else would be swallowed by the space and die before reaching the Emperor's ears. The architecture itself enforced hierarchy. The Emperor's voice mattered. Yours did not. Officials began to arrange themselves by rank, flowing into predetermined positions like water finding its level. First-rank officials closer to the throne, lower ranks farther back. Everyone precisely spaced according to protocols written centuries ago and memorized by every man in the room. There was no confusion, no need for ushers or name tags. Everyone knew exactly where they belonged, because not knowing would be catastrophic. The space they occupied was called their place, and losing it was both a literal and metaphorical disaster. If you forgot your position, you'd revealed that you didn't know your rank. If you took someone else's position, you'd committed an act of social warfare. If you stood in the wrong spot, you'd suggested the entire cosmic order might be negotiable. It was not negotiable. As the officials settled into formation, the silence deepened. This wasn't the comfortable silence of meditation or the peaceful quiet of a library. This was the silence of hundreds of men holding their breath, checking their posture, and preparing for an ordeal that would test both body and mind. The first light of dawn began to filter through the high windows, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like tiny stars. Someone coughed, quickly stifled. Another man's stomach growled audibly, earning him subtle glares from those nearby. These were the sounds of human weakness intruding on cosmic order, and they were not welcome. Then, from somewhere deep within the palace complex, another gong sounded. This one was different, deeper, resonant with meaning. It was the signal that the Emperor was preparing to emerge. The officials, as one, shifted into position, backs straightened to impossible angles, hands tucked into sleeves at precisely the correct height, eyes lowered to the exact spot on the floor that indicated respect without subservience. And they waited. This waiting was itself a test. In a few minutes, the Emperor would appear. But maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he was ill, or distracted, or simply not interested in governing today. The officials had no way of knowing. All they could do was stand, perfectly still, in perfect silence and perfect formation, until told otherwise. Some mornings, the Emperor arrived within minutes. Other mornings, he kept them waiting for an hour or more. There was no pattern, no way to predict. It was a reminder, subtle but unmistakable, that their time belonged to him, their comfort belonged to him, their bodies, standing at attention in the cold or heat, belonged to him. Medieval performance review. Someone once called it, stand still for 6 hours, or lose your head. It's funny because it's true, and it's horrifying because it's true, and it's somehow both at the same time. When the Emperor finally did appear, it was through the great doors at the back of the hall, preceded by eunuchs carrying incense burners. The smoke rose in pale spirals, visible in the morning light, carrying the scent of sandalwood and something else. Something indefinable that you'd forever after associate with anxiety and stiff knees. The officials, at a signal invisible to anyone not trained in palace protocol, began the kowtow. Not a simple bow, not a respectful nod, but the full 9 prostrations. Kneel. Bow forward until your forehead touches the cold marble floor. Rise. Repeat 3 times. Then stunned. Then do it all again. 3 sets of 3. 9 prostrations, total. And if you lost count, you just had to keep going and hope you stopped at the right moment. The sound of hundreds of men performing this ritual simultaneously was strange. A whisper of silk on stone, the soft impact of foreheads on marble, the collective grunt of middle-aged bureaucrats trying to stand up gracefully from a kneeling position. It was synchronized suffering, a ballet of submission for younger officials. The physical challenge was manageable, if humiliating, for older men, those who'd been doing this for decades. It was agony. Knees that had given up on flexibility years ago were forced to bend. Backs that had earned their stiffness through loyalty were commanded to curve. Age and dignity meant nothing. Everyone kowtowed the same way. Because before heaven and the Son of Heaven, all men were equally small. Some officials had servants massage their knees before court, trying to prepare their joints for what was coming. Others took herbal remedies that promised flexibility and pain relief, with mixed results. A few, the truly devoted or truly desperate, practiced at home, kowtowing to a chair or a wall, building up endurance like athletes training for a marathon. Because that's what this was. Really. An endurance test disguised as respect. The emperor would seat himself on the dragon throne, a massive chair that elevated him above everyone else in the room, both literally and symbolically. From there, he was barely visible to the officials in the back, a distant figure in yellow robes. More concept than person, more symbol than human. And then the actual court session would begin. And somehow, everything that had happened so far, the early morning, the elaborate dressing, the long walk, the prostrations, all of that was just the warm-up. The memorial system was the heart of Ming Dynasty governance. Officials from across the empire would submit written reports on everything from military campaigns to tax collection to locust infestations. These memorials were meant to keep the emperor informed, to allow him to make wise decisions based on comprehensive information. In reality, they were mostly paperwork that generated more paperwork. Eunuchs would read the memorials aloud, one after another, in voices trained to project across the enormous hall. The emperor would listen, or pretend to listen, and occasionally respond. His responses were brief, usually just a word or two. Approved. Denied. Investigate further. The real decisions were made elsewhere, in smaller rooms with fewer witnesses. But the morning court maintained the fiction that the emperor personally oversaw every detail of governance, for the officials standing in formation. This part of the morning was perhaps the most challenging, not physically, though their legs were already beginning to ache, but mentally. They had to appear engaged and attentive while listening to reports about grain shipments to provinces they'd never visited and tax disputes they'd never resolve. They had to look interested in the 17th memorial about irrigation without letting their eyes glaze over. They had to stand perfectly still while their bladders filled, their stomachs growled, and their minds wandered to anywhere but here. No bathroom breaks. Not for 6 hours. The human bladder was not designed for court ceremony. But that was the bladder's problem, not the protocols. Officials developed strategies. Drink nothing the night before. Use the bathroom immediately before leaving for court. Think about anything except water, rivers, rain, or the sound of fountains. Some failed. The historical records, discreet but present, mention officials who fainted during court sessions. The official line was always exhaustion or illness. But everyone knew the truth. The human body has limits, and the morning court routine cheerfully exceeded most of them. The court session would continue for hours. More memorials, more imperial responses, occasional discussions when the emperor felt inclined to elaborate. The light streaming through the high windows would shift as the sun rose higher, creating moving patterns on the marble floor that became a kind of clock for the suffering officials. When that patch of light reaches my foot, I'm halfway through. When that shadow moves past that pillar, maybe there's only an hour left. Time became elastic, measured not in minutes but in discomfort. The ache in your lower back became a burning sensation. The burning became a numbness. The numbness became a new kind of pain you didn't know existed. And through it all, you had to maintain perfect composure, perfect posture, perfect attention, because you were being watched, not just by the emperor, who probably couldn't see you anyway from his distant throne, but by your fellow officials, by the eunuchs, by everyone who might benefit from your failure. The Ming dynasty had perfected the art of competitive suffering. It wasn't enough to endure. You had to endure better than everyone else. To show weakness was to fall behind in the invisible rankings that governed palace life. The man who collapsed was weak. The man who swayed was undisciplined. The man who stood perfectly still for 6 hours, looking as fresh at the end as at the beginning. Now, that was someone worth watching. It was a lie. Of course, everyone was suffering. Everyone's knees hurt. Everyone's back screamed. Everyone desperately needed to use the bathroom. But the first rule of palace life was simple: never let them see you break. Finally, after what felt like several lifetimes compressed into a single morning, the signal would come. Another gong, different from the others, meaning the session was ending. The emperor would rise, and the officials would perform one final set of kowtows, somehow finding the strength to kneel one more time, bow one more time, stand one more time, and then the emperor would leave, disappearing through the same doors he'd entered hours ago. The incense smoke trailing behind him like the world's most elaborate exit strategy. For a moment, the officials would remain frozen, uncertain if it was truly over or if this was another test. Then, gradually, the formation would break. Men would straighten carefully, testing backs that had forgotten how to unbend. Knees would crack audibly as officials took their first tentative steps. The stampede to the nearest bathroom was never officially recorded, but it happened. Every single morning, hundreds of men in silk robes, practically running, all pretending they weren't racing each other to the palace latrines. Dignity was important, but bladder relief was survival. In the aftermath, officials would gather in unofficial groups, comparing notes. Did the emperor seem pleased today? Was that approval enthusiastic or merely automatic? Who got mentioned by name? And was that good or bad? The morning court generated hours of analysis, all trying to decode meaning from minimal information. Some would return to their chambers to change clothes. The sweat-soaked inner robes exchanged for fresh ones. Others would head to their offices, paperwork waiting, because the morning performance was just the beginning of the workday, not the end. A few, the older ones, or those pushed beyond their limits, would simply collapse onto whatever furniture was available and wonder how many more years they could keep this up. The answer was usually as many as required. Retirement wasn't really an option. You served until you died or until you were dismissed. And dismissal was often just death with paperwork. The morning court ritual repeated every day, not on holidays, not on the emperor's birthday, not when it rained or snowed, or when the plague swept through Beijing. Every day, the same routine, the same ordeal, the same test of endurance disguised as governance. And here's the strange part: it worked. Not well, not efficiently, but it worked. The morning court created a shared experience of suffering that bonded officials together. When everyone has survived the same absurd ordeal, there's a camaraderie in that, a mutual understanding that you're all trapped in the same magnificent, exhausting, utterly pointless performance. And maybe that was the real purpose all along. Not to govern efficiently, but to create loyalty through shared hardship, to make the officials feel that they'd earned their positions through suffering, and therefore had a stake in maintaining the system that caused that suffering. It was brilliant, in a deeply twisted way. Bureaucracy as endurance sport, government as performance art. Civilization built on the simple principle that if everyone agrees to pretend something matters, it does. The morning court wasn't about running an empire. It was about proving, every single day, that the empire existed, that the cosmic order held, that the Son of Heaven sat on his throne, and the officials kowtowed, and the sun rose, and the world made sense. Even if your knees didn't. And as the sun climbed higher over the forbidden city, casting long shadows across the courtyards where hundreds of men had stood in silent agony, the palace would settle into its daytime rhythm. The drama of the morning court would fade into routine, already being forgotten, already being prepared for again tomorrow. Because in the end, that was the message of the morning court. Tomorrow, you'll do this again, and the day after that, and the day after that, forever, or until you die. Whichever comes first. Sleep well tonight. Be grateful you can hit snooze. They never could. Imagine studying for one test your entire life. Not studying hard. Not cramming for finals. But literally dedicating every waking moment from age 4 until you're middle-aged to preparing for a single examination. If you pass, you become part of the elite. Guaranteed wealth, power, and respect. If you fail, you're nobody. Just another forgotten face in a nation of millions. Now imagine that test happens in a cell the size of a closet, lasts 3 days and 2 nights, and people regularly detaking it. Welcome to the Imperial examinations. China's brilliant, brutal, and utterly exhausting answer to the question, how do we find the best people to run our empire? The answer, apparently, was to torture them first and see who survives. The imperial examinations began in the Sui dynasty around 581 CE, though earlier versions existed before that. The concept was revolutionary for its time, and honestly, for any time. In a world where power came from birth, where nobles ruled because their fathers ruled, China said something radical. What if we chose leaders based on merit instead? It was a beautiful idea. It was also a nightmare in practice. The examination system created a pyramid of suffering. At the bottom were millions of boys who began studying as children, memorizing texts, until their eyes bled and their minds went numb. At each level, county, provincial, and finally metropolitan or palace examinations, the numbers thinned dramatically. Hundreds of thousands would take the county exams, thousands would pass, hundreds would make it to provincial level, and at the very top, the palace examination in Beijing. Only a few dozen would succeed each year. The success rate at the highest level was around 1%. 1% of people who had already beaten the odds multiple times. 1% of the most dedicated, most disciplined, most desperate candidates in the empire. The SAT. But if you fail, your family disowns you, and your village mocks you for the rest of your life. The bar exam, but you take it every 3 years until you die or succeed. The Olympic trials, but for bureaucracy, and the only prize is the chance to work until you collapse. But here's why people kept trying, generation after generation. Despite the odds, it was the only path. If you weren't born into nobility, if your family didn't have connections, if you wanted to rise above your station, this was it. The examinations were the only ladder out of poverty, the only door that talent could open. The promise of meritocracy was intoxicating. You, yes you, the son of a farmer or a shopkeeper or a teacher, you could become a mandarin. You could wear silk robes and have servants and make decisions that affected millions. All you had to do was be brilliant, dedicated, and lucky enough to survive the process. Spoiler alert, most people weren't. The preparation began young, sometimes absurdly young. Boys as young as 4 or 5 would start memorizing the Confucian classics, the foundational texts that formed the entire curriculum, not reading them, memorizing them. Every character, every line, thousands upon thousands of passages committed to memory before you even understood what they meant. The core curriculum consisted of the 4 books and 5 classics, texts written centuries or even millennia earlier by Confucius and his followers. These slim volumes. Combined, they contained hundreds of thousands of characters. Imagine memorizing the entire Encyclopedia Britannica in a language where every word is a unique symbol, and you're starting to understand the scope. But memorization was just the beginning. You also had to master calligraphy, because ugly handwriting could fail you regardless of content. You had to learn to compose poetry in classical forms, with rigid rules about meter, rhyme, and allusion. You had to understand history, philosophy, political theory, all filtered through a Confucian lens that had one correct interpretation and infinite wrong ones. And you had to learn the 8-legged essay, a format so rigid, so structured, so utterly constraining that it made a sonnet look like free verse. The 8-legged essay had rules about everything: how many characters in each section, which classics to quote, how to structure your argument, even how to balance your phrases for rhythmic effect. It was like being asked to solve a Rubik's Cube while reciting Shakespeare and doing calligraphy, all simultaneously, under time pressure, while your entire future hangs in the balance. No pressure. Families invested everything in a promising son. Tutors were hired. If the family could afford them, books were purchased, precious and expensive, in an age before printing was widespread. The boy's time was monopolized, his childhood sacrificed on the altar of potential success. Other children played. Examination candidates studied. Other teenagers explored the world. Examination candidates memorized. Other young men fell in love, married, started families, Examination candidates waited, because you couldn't marry until you'd succeeded. I couldn't start your real life until you'd passed this test that might take decades. Tiger parenting wasn't invented in modern times. It was perfected in Imperial China, where a son's success or failure reflected on the entire family's honor. The pressure was immense, suffocating, inescapable. Your father's hopes, your mother's prayers, your siblings' futures, all resting on your ability to recall obscure passages under stress. Some boys thrived under this pressure, becoming genuine scholars who loved learning for its own sake. These were rare. Most simply endured, studying because they had no choice, because the alternative was accepting mediocrity in a culture that prized achievement above almost everything else. The psychological toll was enormous. Boys developed anxiety that followed them into adulthood. Some had breakdowns, their minds unable to handle the constant pressure. A few ran away, choosing poverty and freedom over wealth and expectations. Most just pushed forward, day after day, year after year, candles burning late into the night, eyes straining over texts written in tiny characters, hands cramping from endless calligraphy practice. And through it all, the knowledge that even if they did everything right, even if they mastered every text and perfected every stroke, they might still fail. Because the examinations weren't just testing knowledge, they were testing endurance, luck, and the ability to perform under conditions designed to break you. When examination day finally arrived, candidates would travel to the provincial capital, sometimes journeying for weeks from remote villages. They'd arrive exhausted, anxious, and facing something that looked less like an examination center and more like a prison. The examination compound was a city within a city, containing thousands of individual cells arranged in long rows. From above, it looked like a honeycomb, each cell a tiny hexagon of suffering. The cells were small, roughly 4 feet by 4 feet. Though dimensions varied by location and time period, just enough room to sit, to kneel, to curl up miserably when exhaustion overcame you. Each cell had a low desk, simply bench, and nothing else. No door, just an open front, so guards could watch. No privacy, no comfort, no mercy. You'd spend 3 days and 2 nights in this space, writing essays that would determine your entire future. The rules were strict and thoroughly enforced. Candidates could bring only the essentials: brushes, ink, paper, food, water, and a blanket. Everything else was forbidden. Books, obviously forbidden. That would be cheating, but also anything that might conceal notes. Extra clothing, suspicious. Thick-soled shoes could hide paper. Food had to be inspected, sliced open to ensure no hidden messages. The body searches before entering were thorough to the point of humiliation. Guards would strip candidates naked, checking every fold of clothing, every possible hiding place. Hair was searched. Body cavities were examined. The message was clear: we trust nothing about you. Some candidates tried to cheat anyway, because humans are creative when desperate. They'd write notes on the inside of clothing in tiny characters. They'd memorize elaborate codes to hide information in innocent-looking phrases. They'd bribe guards, though getting caught meant not just failure but punishment. Most, though, simply resigned themselves to surviving on what they'd stored in their memories over decades of study. The examination began at dawn. Proctors would distribute the questions, and candidates would begin writing. The questions were essay prompts based on Confucian texts, deliberately vague enough to require extensive interpretation. Discuss the role of ritual in maintaining social harmony. Elaborate on Mencius's concept of human nature. Questions that had no single correct answer, but definitely had wrong ones. The first day was bearable. Candidates were fresh. Relatively speaking, nerves provided energy. Hope sustained focus. The essays flowed. Brushstrokes forming characters with practiced precision. The first night was harder. The cells had no heating. No lighting beyond what faint moonlight might provide. Candidates would wrap themselves in thin blankets, trying to sleep on wooden benches designed by people who'd apparently never experienced comfort. The cold seeped into bones. Strange sounds echoed through the compound. Someone crying. Someone praying. Someone's stomach rebelling against questionable food. And around 3 in the morning, when exhaustion finally dragged you towards sleep, you'd hear it. The scream. Someone having a breakdown. Their mind unable to handle the pressure. Guards would rush over, but quietly, so as not to disturb the other candidates. The screaming would stop, one way or another. Day 2 was the test of will. The initial adrenaline had faded. Bodies were stiff from sitting in cramped positions. Eyes burned from straining to read and write. Hands cramped around brushes that felt increasingly heavy. And the questions kept coming, each one requiring sustained focus and elaborate responses. Some candidates began to break down physically. Stomach problems were common. Given the stress and questionable food, the latrine buckets in each cell filled, creating a smell that permeated everything. There was no privacy for this basic human need. Just a bucket in the corner, and the knowledge that everyone else was in the same humiliating situation. Summer examinations were particularly brutal. The heat in the cells became unbearable. Candidates sweating through their clothing, fighting off mosquitoes and flies attracted by the latrine buckets. Some fainted from heat exhaustion. Some died. Their bodies carried out quietly, while the examination continued around them. Winter examinations had their own horror. The cold was so intense that ink would freeze in the inkstones. Candidates had to warm the ink with their breath, producing a few characters before it froze again. Fingers went numb. Thinking became sluggish. And still the examination continued, because weather was no excuse for failure. The second night was worse than the first. Sleep, if it came at all, was shallow and haunted. Dreams mixed with reality. You'd wake unsure if you'd actually written that last essay or just dreamed it. Candidates would check their papers anxiously, trying to read by moonlight, making sure they hadn't imagined their progress. By day 3, many candidates were in a semi-hallucinatory state. Days without real sleep, limited food, constant stress, and physical discomfort had pushed them beyond normal human endurance. They wrote because they had to, because stopping meant failure, because they'd come too far to quit now. Some candidates would look at their essays from day 1 and not recognize their own handwriting. The careful calligraphy had devolved into desperate scrawls. The elaborate arguments had simplified into basic assertions. But they kept writing because incomplete essays were automatic failures. Finally, mercifully, the examination would end. A bell would ring, and candidates would put down their brushes, minds too exhausted for relief, bodies too numb for celebration. They'd gather their papers, exit their cells, and stumble into sunlight that seemed impossibly bright. After days in dim confinement, the aftermath was its own kind of ordeal. Many candidates couldn't walk properly, their legs having forgotten how, after 3 days of cramped sitting. Some collapsed immediately, their bodies finally allowed to acknowledge the abuse they'd endured. Others wandered in a daze, not quite believing it was over. But it wasn't really over. Now came the waiting. Weeks or months, while officials graded thousands of essays, looking for the perfect combination of knowledge, eloquence, and most importantly, orthodoxy. Because here's the secret that made the entire system both brilliant and insane. The examinations weren't really testing how smart you were. They were testing how well you could think exactly like everyone else while appearing to think for yourself. The 8-legged essay format was a straitjacket disguised as literary form. 8 distinct sections, each with specific requirements. Opening statement, elaboration, initial argument, counter-argument, synthesis, supporting evidence, further synthesis, conclusion. Deviation from this structure meant failure. But within this rigid framework, you had to appear original. You had to quote the classics everyone knew while making it seem like fresh insight. You had to follow orthodox Confucian interpretation while making it sound like personal understanding. You had to be simultaneously derivative and original, conformist and creative. It was like being asked to write a standardized test essay that's both completely predictable and surprisingly innovative. The sweet spot was narrow, and finding it required not just knowledge, but intuition about what the graders wanted to hear. The graders themselves were former examination passers, men who'd succeeded in this system and now perpetuated it. They knew all the tricks, recognized all the standard arguments, and were deeply suspicious of anything too creative. Original thinking was dangerous. Criticism of the system was unthinkable. The safe path was to demonstrate perfect mastery of traditional wisdom, while adding just enough rhetorical flourish to seem educated rather than merely trained. Examinations were graded anonymously, with candidates identified by number rather than name. This was meant to prevent favoritism, and to some extent it worked. But graders could still identify regional styles, recognize teachers' influences, even guess at family backgrounds from the quality of calligraphy and paper. Perfect anonymity was impossible. The results were posted publicly, names written on large boards in order of success. The top scorer's name was posted first, sometimes in letters large enough to read from across the plaza. He'd become instantly famous, his success immortalizing not just him, but his family, his village, his teacher, for those whose names appeared on the list. Unimposition. The celebration was extraordinary. Families would hold banquets. Villagers would throw parades. The successful candidate would be carried through streets to drums and firecrackers, wearing special robes that announced his achievement to everyone he passed. It was the ancient equivalent of winning the lottery, the Super Bowl, and a Rhodes Scholarship simultaneously. Your life had changed forever. You'd escaped the fate of ordinary people. You'd proven yourself worthy. For those whose names didn't appear, the despair was equally profound. Some would return home to try again in 3 years. If they could afford to keep studying, others would give up, accepting that they'd spent decades preparing for something they'd never achieve. The psychological devastation was immense. Your identity had been wrapped up in this goal since childhood. Your family's hopes had focused on your success. Your own sense of worth had become tied to passing this examination. And now, publicly, definitively, you'd failed. Some candidates took failure philosophically, finding other paths in life. Many more fell into depression, their dreams crushed, their years of study seemingly wasted. A few committed suicide, unable to face the shame of failure after so much investment. The lucky ones failed young enough to try again. The tragic ones failed after decades of attempts, finally accepting in middle age that they'd never pass, that they'd wasted their entire youth chasing an impossible dream. Famous historical failures included some of China's greatest poets and artists. Li Bai, considered one of the finest poets in Chinese history, failed the examinations. His brilliance was too original, too creative for the rigid format. The system designed to find talent had missed one of the most talented people in Chinese history. This happened repeatedly. The examinations selected for a specific type of intelligence memorization, conformity, endurance. They missed creative thinkers, innovative problem solvers, anyone whose genius manifested in ways the system didn't measure. But for all its flaws, the examination system did something remarkable. It created social mobility in a rigidly hierarchical society. Farmers' sons could become ministers. Shopkeepers' grandsons could become governors. Talent, at least a certain kind of talent, could overcome birth. The system lasted for over 1,300 years. From the Sui dynasty through the end of the Qing in 1905. Longer than most empires exist. Longer than most institutions survive. It shaped Chinese culture profoundly, creating an emphasis on education, on meritocracy, on the idea that knowledge and hard work could transform your fate. The legacy persists today. Modern China's Gaokao, the college entrance examination, follows similar principles. A single test determining your future. Enormous pressure on students. Families investing everything in educational success. The specific content has changed, but the underlying philosophy remains. Prove your worth through examination. Earn your place through suffering. Korea's and Japan's examination cultures also trace back to this system. The idea that a standardized test can fairly measure human potential, that suffering through brutal academic pressure builds character, that educational achievement matters more than almost anything else. These beliefs originated in the imperial examination system. Was it fair? More fair than aristocracy. Less fair than genuine meritocracy. Wealthy families could afford better tutors, more books, more time for their sons to study. Poor families had to choose between education and survival. But at least the door was theoretically open to everyone. Was it effective? It created a highly educated bureaucracy, unified by shared knowledge and shared suffering. It also created conservative leaders afraid of innovation, officials trained to follow precedent rather than think independently. The system's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness. It selected for conformity in an age that eventually required change. The examination cells are museums now, preserved as historical sites. You can visit them. Walk between the rows of tiny spaces where millions of men suffered for their ambitions. The cells are empty, silent, almost peaceful in their stillness. But stand there on a quiet day, and you can almost feel it. The echo of desperate hope, the weight of impossible pressure, the sound of brushes on paper, writing essays that would determine everything, the ghost of a system that turned education into endurance sport and called it meritocracy. The imperial examinations were humanity's most ambitious attempt to make fairness out of suffering. They said, "We'll judge you by ability, not birth, but only after you prove you can survive hell." It was meritocracy designed by people who'd never heard the word trauma. And yet, for all its cruelty, it worked. For 13 centuries, it elevated brilliant men from poverty to power. It built one of history's most sophisticated bureaucracies. It proved that humans will endure almost anything if you promise them meaning on the other side. The cells are empty now. The questions will never be answered again. But the legacy remains, written in the educational cultures of 1 billion people who still believe that suffering through examinations can transform your fate. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong. But either way, be grateful. Your worst test was probably a few hours in an uncomfortable chair. Theirs was 3 days in a cell the size of a closet, writing essays about virtue, while your mind broke, and your body rebelled, and your future hung in the balance. Sleep well. Dream of easier paths. And remember, somewhere in history, someone endured worse to get where you are now. Imagine your marriage being decided by a committee of elderly officials you've never met, based on criteria that have nothing to do with love, compatibility, or even basic human connection. Now, imagine you're the groom. You're the Emperor of China, the most powerful man on earth, and you have absolutely no say in the matter. Welcome to the Imperial wedding, where romance went to die and state policy wore a wedding dress. If modern weddings are stressful, with their seating charts and flower arrangements and family drama, the Imperial wedding was that anxiety multiplied by 1,000 and stretched over 17 hours. It was part political alliance, part religious ceremony, part theatrical performance, and absolutely 0% about the actual people getting married. The bride and groom were props in a drama written by bureaucracy, directed by tradition, and performed for an audience of ancestors, officials, and the cosmic order itself. Their feelings on the matter were not requested, not considered, and definitely not relevant. But let's start at the beginning, which in this case means the selection process, or, as historians politely call it, the draft of consorts. A more accurate name would be the day your life ends and your role begins. Every few years, when the emperor needed a wife, or more likely, when his mother decided he needed a wife, the imperial court would announce a draft. This wasn't a military draft, though given what followed, combat might have been preferable. This was a summons for eligible girls from Manchu noble families to present themselves for inspection. The criteria were specific and completely insane by modern standards. Age 13 to 16 years old. Background Manchu nobility only. Specific clans preferred. Physical requirements. Detailed and degrading. Astrological compatibility. Determined by birth date and cosmic calculations that no one really understood, but everyone pretended were scientific. Notice what's not on that list. Personality, intelligence, interests, whether she wanted this, whether the emperor wanted her, none of that mattered. Because the imperial marriage wasn't about building a partnership. It was about producing heirs, maintaining political alliances, and ensuring the cosmic order remained properly balanced. The selection process itself was theater of the most uncomfortable kind. Girls who'd been summoned, terrified, and trying desperately to appear calm, would be paraded before the Empress Dowager and a committee of senior officials. Not the emperor. Mind you, he didn't get a vote. His mother did. The Empress Dowager, usually the emperor's mother or grandmother, held absolute power over this decision. She'd examine each girl with the critical eye of someone evaluating livestock, checking posture, skin tone, deportment, and that indefinable quality called suitability, which really meant unlikely to threaten my power. The inspection was humiliating. Girls stood in identical formal dress, forbidden to speak, unless spoken to, barely allowed to breathe too loudly. Officials would circle them, noting everything. Too tall, too short, smile too confident, expression too meek, hands too rough, feet too large. Every physical attribute was scrutinized, commented upon, and recorded. Mothers had coached their daughters for weeks before this moment. Stand straight, but not too straight. Look modest, but not terrified. Show deference, but not weakness. It was an impossible balance, and everyone knew it. The selection was predetermined anyway. Based on political considerations the girls would never understand. The Empress Dowager's criteria were brutally practical. She wanted a girl from a politically useful family, preferably one that owed the palace favors. She wanted someone young enough to be molded, smart enough to learn protocol quickly, but not so clever as to become a threat. She wanted beauty, but not the kind that might make the emperor actually fall in love. Because love was a liability in palace politics. Most importantly, she wanted someone she could control. The perfect empress was a beautiful, obedient, politically connected girl who would produce heirs and then disappear into the background of palace life, never challenging the Empress Dowager's authority. Love was not just irrelevant. Love was dangerous. An emperor in love might listen to his wife instead of his mother. He might make decisions based on emotion rather than state policy. He might, horror of horrors, become harder to control. So the Empress Dowager chose carefully, weighing politics and personality, and selected the girl who would cause the least disruption to the existing power structure. That girl became the Empress Designate. Several others would be selected as imperial consorts. Because one wife was never enough when you needed redundancy in heir production. The Bachelor. But everyone's crying and it's your grandmother choosing. Tinder. But it's your mom swiping and the match is permanent. Speed dating where you don't speak. And marriage is mandatory. For the selected girls, life changed instantly and irrevocably. They were removed from their families immediately, moved into the Forbidden City, and began a training period that can best be described as finishing school meets minimum security prison. The training lasted 3 to 6 months, and its purpose was simple: erase who you were and teach you who you needed to be. The curriculum covered court etiquette, which was infinitely more complex than anything you can imagine. How to walk small steps, no swaying, perfect posture, how to talk softly, formally, saying as little as possible, how to sit, stand, kneel, bow, eat, drink, all according to protocols that filled volumes. They learned the hierarchy of the palace, memorizing the ranks of every official, every consort, every servant. They learned which colors they could wear, which they couldn't, and why wearing the wrong shade of yellow could get you executed. They learned the ceremonial calendar, the endless cycle of rituals and observances that structured palace life. But most importantly, they learned how to be invisible while visible, how to be decorative without being distracting, how to anticipate needs without seeming presumptuous, how to have opinions without expressing them, how to exist as a function rather than a person. The teachers were elderly palace women, former consorts who'd survived the system and now perpetuated it. They were not kind. Kindness suggested these girls had feelings worth considering, and that was a dangerous precedent. Instead, the teachers were strict, critical, and occasionally cruel, because they knew what awaited their students and were trying, in their own twisted way, to prepare them for it. The psychological preparation was the most brutal part. The girls had to accept that their former lives were over. Their families would become strangers, people they might never see again. Their childhood friends would fade into memory. Their dreams, whatever they'd been, no longer mattered. They had to accept that they were now roles, not people. The Empress, the Imperial consort, functions in a machine larger than any individual. Their purpose was to produce heirs, maintain proper ceremony, and die quietly when their time came. They had to accept that the Emperor would never really know them, might never speak to them beyond formal occasions, would certainly never love them, and that this was normal, expected, the way things had always been and always would be. Some girls broke during this training period. They'd be found weeping in their chambers or staring blankly at walls, their minds unable to process this new reality. These breakdowns were noted but not particularly concerning. Everyone broke eventually. The question was whether you broke quietly or caused disruption. The smart ones learned the real curriculum, the one never spoken aloud. They learned that the other consorts were enemies competing for limited imperial attention. They learned that eunuchs held more practical power than most officials and should be cultivated carefully. They learned that in the palace, information was currency and secrets were valuable. They learned that survival meant mastering the art of palace politics while appearing to be above such concerns. The Emperor might ignore you, but if the Empress Dowager favored you, or if you could forge alliances with powerful officials through careful manipulation, you might carve out some small space of security. But mostly, they learned to wait, to be patient, to accept that their lives had become an endless series of ceremonies and protocols with brief moments of actual living scattered in between like rare jewels in endless stone. Then came the wedding day. And suddenly all that preparation felt completely inadequate. 17 hours. That's how long an imperial wedding lasted. From pre-dawn preparation to late evening conclusion, 17 hours of non-stop ceremony, ritual, and performance. 96 separate procedures. Each one crucial. Each one requiring perfect execution. 3 costume changes. Because apparently one wedding dress wasn't sufficient torture. And 0 bathroom breaks. Because cosmic order waits for no bladder. The day began at 3 in the morning. Because of course it did. The bride was awakened by a team of palace women who would spend the next several hours transforming her from a terrified teenager into a living symbol of imperial power and feminine virtue. The makeup alone took 3 hours, not because they were going for a natural look, but because natural wasn't the goal. The goal was human porcelain doll with symbolically correct color scheme. The bride's face was painted white, pure white, using lead-based makeup that was probably slowly poisoning her. Her lips were painted in a perfect bow shape with vermilion, a color derived from cinnabar that was definitely poisoning her. Her eyebrows were darkened, her cheeks rouged, until she looked less like herself and more like every other empress in every other portrait. The effect was striking and deeply unsettling. She looked beautiful in the way a statue is beautiful. Perfect. Cold. Inhuman. Then came the hair, which required its own team of specialists. The elaborate style took hours to construct, involving extensions, wireframes, and enough pins to build a small fence. The finished product was a towering architectural achievement that added several inches to her height and several pounds to her head. The weight caused neck strain within minutes. By hour 10 of the wedding day, it would cause genuine agony. Finally, the dress. Oh, the dress. Imperial wedding gowns weren't clothing. They were structural engineering projects that happened to be made of fabric. The Empress's gown weighed over 20 pounds. Constructed from layers of silk, embroidered with real gold thread, and decorated with thousands of pearls and precious stones. The symbolism was extensive and exhausting, dragons and phoenixes intertwined. Representing the Emperor and Empress in cosmic harmony, clouds suggested heavenly approval. Waves indicated the empire's extent to the four seas. Flowers represented fertility and the hope for many sons. Every design element meant something, and collectively, they meant this woman is no longer an individual, but a symbol of imperial power, and you should be very, very impressed. The dress was so heavy and restrictive that the bride couldn't move independently. She needed assistance to walk, to sit, to do anything besides. Stand very still and look. Symbolic. The sleeves extended past her hands, because functional clothing was apparently too practical for an imperial wedding. The train stretched behind her for yards, requiring 2 attendants just to manage. Getting dressed took another 2 hours, with multiple palace women working together to lift, arrange, and fasten the various components. By the time it was finished, the bride had been standing, mostly still, for over 4 hours. She hadn't eaten, because eating might smudge the makeup. She hadn't had anything to drink, because the bathroom situation was about to become impossible, and the wedding hadn't even started yet. The procession from the bride's chambers to the wedding hall took over an hour. Despite the distance being perhaps half a mile, this was because the bride traveled in a palanquin, a sealed sedan chair carried by 16 bearers, who moved at a ceremonial pace that can best be described as glacial, with occasional pauses for ritual significance. Inside the palanquin, the bride sat in darkness, alone with her thoughts for perhaps the last time in her life. The chair swayed as the bearers walked, making her slightly nauseous on top of everything else. She could hear music outside, drums and gongs, announcing her approach, but she couldn't see anything, just darkness, the smell of incense, and the growing realization that when this chair opened, her old life would be completely over. When the palanquin finally reached the wedding hall and the doors opened, the bride was helped out by attendants and faced her first view of the ceremony space. It was overwhelming. Thousands of guests, all in formal robes, all watching her. The hall decorated with red and gold. The imperial colors, incense smoke, so thick it was hard to breathe. And at the far end, barely visible through the smoke and distance, a figure in yellow robes. The emperor, her husband, a stranger. The ceremonies themselves were endless. Bowing to heaven and earth came first. The bride and groom kneeling before an altar laden with offerings, then bowing to the tablets of the imperial ancestors. Row after row of dead emperors, watching through carved wooden representations, then bowing to the living, the Empress Dowager. Senior princes, high officials, each according to their rank. Finally, mercifully, they bowed to each other. Once, a single moment of acknowledgement between the two people whose lives were being permanently joined. Then it was back to bowing to everyone else. The tea ceremony was its own special torture. The new empress had to serve tea to every senior member of the imperial family, individually, with perfect grace, despite the weight of her dress and the fatigue setting in. Each person would accept the tea, offer formal congratulations that sounded like bureaucratic memos, and present a gift. The gifts piled up: jade ornaments, gold jewelry, bolts of silk, carved furniture. Each gift was announced formally, recorded by clerks, and added to the Empress's official property. None of it was really hers. Of course, it all belonged to her role, not to her as a person. Between ceremonies, the couple would stand or sit, silent, while officials read proclamations, monks chanted blessings, and musicians played ceremonial pieces. They couldn't speak to each other, couldn't relax, couldn't show fatigue or discomfort. They were performing for an audience that included not just the visible guests, but the invisible ancestors, the gods, and the cosmic order itself. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, then began to descend. The bride's feet, in embroidered shoes, never designed for standing this long, swelled painfully. The emperor, in his own heavy ceremonial robes, looked increasingly uncomfortable but couldn't show it. Both were trapped in roles that required inhuman endurance. Women fainted during imperial weddings. It was expected. Attendants would catch them, revive them quietly, and the ceremony would continue as if nothing had happened. Showing weakness was embarrassing, but less embarrassing than disrupting the ritual flow. The absurdity reached its peak during the symbolic gift exchanges. The emperor would present the empress with items representing various virtues: a book for wisdom, a mirror for self-reflection, a seal for authority. Each gift required elaborate protocol. Accepting it with the proper gesture, displaying it to the audience, placing it in the correct location. The cost of all this ceremony could have fed a province for a year. The gold thread in the empress's dress alone represented more wealth than a farmer would see in a lifetime. Thousands of work hours went into preparations. And for what? To join two teenagers who didn't know each other and probably wouldn't get along if they did. They put more thought into the table settings than compatibility, more energy into the seating chart than into whether these two humans might actually like each other. The wedding was diplomacy theater, ancestor worship, and bureaucratic procedure, all wrapped in silk and called romance. As evening finally approached, the final ceremonies concluded. The couple was escorted, separately, to the bridal chamber. This too was a ceremony, with officials and attendants forming processions, carrying lanterns and symbolic objects, treating the simple act of going to a room as if it required diplomatic negotiations. The wedding night, that most intimate of moments, was about as private as a public execution. The couple entered the elaborately decorated chamber, which had been prepared for weeks. Red silk everywhere, symbolizing joy and fertility. Candles burning, creating a warm glow. Fruit and wine laid out, most of which would go untouched. And outside the door, a crowd. Officials waiting to verify the marriage was consummated. Eunuchs listening for sounds that would confirm the deed was done. Physicians ready to examine evidence. Privacy was a myth. Even this moment, which should have belonged to two people alone, belonged to the state. Inside the room, two exhausted teenagers faced each other for the first time without an audience of thousands. Both were terrified. Both were uncomfortable. Both knew what was expected but had no idea how to achieve it under these circumstances. Some emperors were kind, trying to ease the situation with gentle words. Some were awkward, equally victims of this system. Some were clinical, treating it as another duty to be completed efficiently. The bride had no say in the matter. Her role was to submit, to accept, to become pregnant as quickly as possible. The supervision from outside wasn't subtle. When sufficient time had passed, officials would knock, requesting confirmation. Sometimes a white cloth would be presented as proof, a medieval practice that was degrading and medically meaningless, but persisted because tradition demanded it. Nothing says romance like bureaucratic oversight. Consummate your marriage while civil servants take notes. The least sexy thing ever invented by humans. The morning after was no better. Medical examinations. Invasive and humiliating. To confirm pregnancy wasn't already occurring. Public announcements of the marriage's consummation. As if everyone in the empire needed to know. If pregnancy resulted quickly, the new empress's value skyrocketed. If not, pressure mounted to try again. And again, and again, the empress's daily life after marriage was structured, empty, and fearful. She lived in luxurious chambers, surrounded by servants, but effectively imprisoned. She couldn't leave the forbidden city without permission, which was rarely granted. She couldn't visit her family. She couldn't make friends without suspicion. She couldn't pursue interests without approval. Her schedule was regimented: morning rituals, afternoon duties, evening observations. Every moment prescribed, every action watched. She might see the emperor monthly, if she was lucky. More likely, much less. His time was divided among multiple consorts, each competing for the attention that meant security. Most empresses lived and died without ever really knowing their husbands. They'd share brief, formal encounters, produce children, if fortune allowed, and otherwise exist in parallel lives that never quite intersected. It was marriage as institutional arrangement, completely divorced from companionship, affection, or mutual understanding. The rare exceptions, empresses who gained genuine power, required ruthlessness, intelligence, and extraordinary luck. Empress Dowager Cixi managed it by outliving everyone and refusing to retire when expected. But she was one in thousands. Most empresses lived quietly, aged invisibly, and died, unmourned outside their immediate family. The irony was profound. The most powerful man in China married to a woman he didn't know, both trapped in roles that precluded genuine human connection, both performing marriage without experiencing it, neither free. Despite all the gold and silk and ceremonies suggesting otherwise, the imperial wedding was the world's most expensive performance of a marriage that barely existed. Two people dressed in gold, bowing to the universe, binding themselves to a life of magnificent loneliness. They stood together but separate, united by ceremony but divided by duty. The West had arranged marriages too, but China perfected it, turned it into art, into ceremony, into a 17-hour demonstration that love was irrelevant and duty was everything. The wedding was beautiful. The bride was beautiful. The groom was powerful. And none of it mattered because beauty and power couldn't create connection when the system was designed to prevent it. And somewhere in that endless ritual, two teenagers stood side by side, strangers in golden cages, learning the first lesson of palace life. You can be surrounded by thousands and still be completely alone. The wedding ended. The marriage never really began, and life in the Forbidden City continued. Beautiful, brutal, and utterly empty. The wedding halls are silent now. The ceremonies aren't performed anymore, but the lesson remains, written in the spaces between all that gold and silk. The most elaborate display of commitment can coexist with complete absence of connection. You can bind two lives together and still leave both of them isolated. You can call something marriage and never create anything resembling partnership. Sleep well. Be grateful for choice. Be grateful for privacy. Be grateful that your wedding, however stressful, probably didn't require 17 hours of ceremony supervised by bureaucrats documenting your intimate moments. And remember, somewhere in history, two people stood in clothes so heavy they could barely move, bowed to ancestors they'd never meet, and promised their lives to a stranger, all because the cosmic order required proper theatrical performance. They played their parts perfectly, and that, somehow, was supposed to be enough. Most people start planning their funeral when they're dying. Maybe they mention in passing that they'd prefer cremation, or that they want a specific song played, or that under no circumstances should Aunt Margaret give the eulogy. Chinese emperors started planning their funerals the day they were crowned. Because death, like everything else in Imperial China, required perfect performance, and perfect performance required decades of preparation. When a new emperor ascended the dragon throne, usually as a young man, one of his first official acts was to commission his coffin. Not a simple box. Not something knocked together by the palace carpenter in an afternoon. This was a coffin that would take years to construct, cost more than most people would earn in 1,000 lifetimes, and require an entire workshop dedicated to its creation. The wood had to be perfect, not oak or pine or whatever was growing nearby. No. Imperial coffins were made from golden Nanmu wood, a rare timber found only in remote mountain forests, prized for its aromatic scent and resistance to decay. Acquiring enough of this wood for a coffin large enough to hold an emperor, his robes, and his dignity required expeditions into the wilderness, negotiations with local authorities, and expenses that would make modern defense contractors blush. The construction took years because every surface had to be carved, lacquered, gilded, and decorated with symbols of immortality and imperial power. Dragons coiled along the sides. Clouds drifted across the top. Inside, the wood was lined with silk and gold leaf, creating a final resting place, more luxurious than most living rooms. When finished, the coffin was stored in a special hall within the palace. Waiting, the emperor would visit it occasionally, contemplating his mortality in what was either profound wisdom or deeply unsettling psychological practice, depending on your perspective. Imagine having a standing appointment to visit your own coffin for quality control. Talk about long-term planning. But the coffin was just the beginning. The real preparation was the tomb. And tomb construction made coffin preparation look like an afternoon craft project. Imperial tombs were underground palaces. And they weren't built after death. They were built during life, sometimes taking decades to complete. The moment an emperor was crowned, 2 location scouts would fan out across the empire, searching for the perfect burial site. This wasn't a real estate decision made over coffee. This was geomancy, feng shui on an imperial scale, searching for a location where the cosmic energies aligned perfectly to ensure the emperor's peaceful rest and the dynasty's continued prosperity. The ideal site needed mountains behind for support, water in front for prosperity, specific orientations to cardinal directions, and probably a dozen other factors that would take a doctorate in traditional Chinese cosmology to fully understand. When a suitable location was finally found, construction would begin immediately. Thousands of workers, sometimes tens of thousands, would spend years carving into mountainsides, building underground chambers, constructing what amounted to a subterranean city. The scale was absurd. The main burial chamber alone could be the size of a warehouse. Then came antechambers for treasures, halls for offerings, passages for who knows what. The whole complex might extend hundreds of feet underground and cover acres of surface area. Everything the emperor might need in the afterlife was considered bedrooms, because apparently death doesn't mean you stop needing sleep. Dining halls, because hungry ghosts are irritable ghosts. Storage rooms for all the gold, yade, and precious objects that would be buried with him. Basically, if you could have it in life, you'd need it in death. According to the philosophy guiding tomb construction, the workers who built these tombs knew secrets that needed to stay secret. The location of treasures, the layout of passages, the mechanisms of traps designed to discourage tomb robbers. This created an ethical dilemma that was solved in the most horrifying way imaginable. In some dynasties, particularly earlier ones, the workers who completed the tomb were executed or sealed inside it, ensuring they'd never reveal what they knew. Nothing says thanks for your service quite like murder to protect trade secrets. The ultimate non-disclosure agreement, death. By later dynasties, this practice had mostly ended, replaced by slightly less murderous security measures. But the fact that it happened at all tells you something about the priorities. Secrecy mattered more than human life. The emperor's eternal rest mattered more than the worker's temporary existence. So the emperor would live his life knowing that somewhere workers were carving his tomb, building his underworld palace, preparing for a death that might be decades away. It was supposed to be comforting. This preparation, it showed wisdom, foresight, acceptance of mortality. Confucian philosophy emphasized honoring ancestors. And what better way to honor your future ghost self than by building it a palace? But imagine living with that knowledge every day, knowing that workers are building your tomb. Every decision about tomb design is a decision about your death. Every visit to check on construction progress is a reminder that someday, probably sooner than you'd like, you'll be moving into that underground palace permanently. The ultimate long-term planning. Imagine visiting your own grave site for progress reports. Death. The one appointment you can't miss. So you prepare for 40 years. When death finally came, often suddenly, despite all the preparation, the palace would shift into a carefully choreographed crisis mode. The emperor's death was simultaneously the most important event in the empire and the most dangerous. Transitions of power created opportunities for coups, rebellions, and political chaos. So the death was often hidden, sometimes for days. While the inner circle secured the succession, only a handful of people would know initially: the Empress Dowager, the heir apparent, top ministers, and the eunuchs who'd been present. They'd gather in secret, make rapid decisions about succession, and prepare announcements carefully crafted to prevent panic. Meanwhile, the emperor's body would be prepared for the long journey between death and burial. This wasn't embalming in the modern sense. The techniques varied by dynasty and circumstance, but generally involved packing the body in salt, ice, or preservatives, wrapping it in silk, and placing it in a temporary coffin until the official funeral could be arranged. The announcement, when it finally came, was theater in itself. At midnight, gongs would sound throughout the Forbidden City, their deep resonance carrying across Beijing. Then drums, slow and steady, the heartbeat of an empire, acknowledging its loss. Citizens would know immediately what those sounds meant. The Son of Heaven had returned to heaven. and the world had just become a more uncertain place. Empire-wide mourning was declared instantly and absolutely. Not suggested, not encouraged, but mandated. Theaters closed, music silenced, weddings postponed. Anyone planning to celebrate anything would need to reschedule. Because joy was now officially forbidden, the dress code changed overnight. White, the Chinese color of mourning, replaced the colorful robes of daily life. Officials and commoners alike would change into white garments, signaling their participation in collective grief. Failing to mourn properly was not just rude. It was potentially treasonous, suggesting you weren't sufficiently loyal to the deceased emperor. Men stopped shaving and cutting their hair, because grooming suggested you cared about appearance when you should only care about grief. This created a nation of increasingly disheveled citizens, all trying to outgrieve each other through strategic neglect of personal hygiene. The performance of mourning was itself a political act. Officials would gather at the palace, wailing with practiced grief. The quality of your wailing mattered. Too quiet suggested insufficient loyalty. Too theatrical suggested insincerity. The sweet spot was authentic, seeming devastation, performed with enough control to maintain dignity, but enough emotion to demonstrate genuine feeling. Some officials were genuinely grief-stricken, having served the emperor loyally for decades. Others were performing, calculating how their mourning would be perceived and what it might mean for their careers. Under the new emperor, most were probably both grief and calculation, mixing in that uniquely human way where genuine emotion coexists with political awareness. The imperial family's performance was the most scrutinized H-blank. The heir, now emperor, had to display filial piety through extreme mourning while simultaneously projecting strength and authority. It was an impossible balance. Show you're devastated by your father's death without suggesting you're too weak to rule. Widows and consorts faced their own challenges. Their status was suddenly uncertain. A favored consort might find herself ignored under the new administration. An ignored consort might suddenly gain influence if she'd cultivated relationships carefully. The emperor's death was a shuffle of the political deck, and everyone was frantically trying to understand the new hand they'd been dealt. In early dynasties, the situation for consorts was far worse. Some were expected, or even forced, to follow the emperor in death. Ritual suicide or execution, dressed up in language about loyalty and devotion, but resulting in the same grim outcome. Young women who'd barely known the emperor would be sacrificed to keep him company in the afterlife. As if death wasn't lonely enough on its own. By later dynasties, this practice had mostly ended, replaced by mandatory mourning and lifetime confinement to the palace. Progress. Sort of. Instead of dying, you'd just wish you had while spending the next 50 years in widow's white. Forbidden from remarrying. Slowly being forgotten by everyone except the historians who'd eventually record your name in lists of imperial consorts. They scheduled spontaneous grief, mandatory sadness, the ultimate oxymoron. Nothing says I'm devastated like following a 500-page manual on proper crying. As days passed and the immediate shock faded, preparations for the funeral procession would begin. This wasn't a matter of scheduling a hearse and picking a cemetery. This was mobilizing thousands of people for a journey that would take days or weeks. Moving the emperor's body from the Forbidden City to the tomb site, which could be 100 miles away or more. The procession itself was mobile theater on an unprecedented scale. Imagine a parade so elaborate, it takes 3 days to pass one point. That's not a festival. That's moving a dead emperor and everything his afterlife might require across the Chinese countryside. The coffin. That masterpiece of golden Nanmu wood was placed on an enormous catafalque, a ceremonial platform carried by 120 bearers, not carried easily. Either. The coffin alone weighed thousands of pounds. Add the platform, the decorations, and the elaborate canopy overhead, and you're talking about a structure that required coordination, strength, and probably a lot of prayer that no one would stumble. The procession stretched for miles, a serpent of mourning winding through the landscape. The order was specific, prescribed by centuries of tradition, and absolutely not subject to change, regardless of practical considerations. First came the advance scouts, traveling days ahead to clear roads, prepare way stations, and warn everyone in the path that the imperial funeral was coming. Roads had to be perfect, because a pothole that jostled the emperor's remains was a cosmic offense. Bridges had to be reinforced, because collapsing under the weight of the imperial coffin was exactly the kind of disaster that got people executed for incompetence. Behind the scouts came the road clearers, physically removing any obstacles and decorating the route with yellow silk. The imperial color, entire stretches of roadway would be covered in fabric, creating a golden path for the emperor's final journey. The cost was bankrupting, but apparently regular roads weren't dignified enough for royal corpses. Then came the incense bearers, hundreds of them, swinging censers that filled the air with smoke. The ostensible purpose was religious, purifying the path and honoring the deceased. The practical purpose was covering the smell, because even with preservation techniques, moving a corpse across China in summer was an olfactory challenge. Musicians followed, playing funeral dirges on instruments designed for somber occasions. Not your sad piano ballad, but deep drums, low horns, sounds that resonated in your chest and made you think about mortality, whether you wanted to or not. They'd play continuously, day and night, musicians rotating in shifts to maintain the soundtrack of grief. Buddhist monks and Taoist priests came next, chanting sutras and performing rituals to guide the emperor's soul to the afterlife. The combination of Buddhist and Taoist elements was typical of Chinese religious syncretism. Why settle for one afterlife insurance policy when you can have two? Then the banners, enormous silk flags representing every virtue and achievement of the deceased emperor. Wisdom, justice, filial piety, military prowess, each one carried by a designated official, and each one requiring its own team, because silk that size catches wind like a sail and will absolutely drag you across the countryside if you're not careful. Imperial guards surrounded the coffin, thousands of soldiers in full ceremonial armor, despite the heat, despite the exhaustion, despite the fact that the emperor was already dead and unlikely to be attacked. The guards were symbolic protection but also crowd control, ensuring commoners maintained proper distance and respect. The coffin itself, when it finally appeared, was overwhelming. Massive, gilded, covered in elaborate carvings and decorations that caught the light and created an effect that was both beautiful and unsettling. This was death. But death dressed in so much gold, it almost looked like victory. Behind the coffin came the imperial family, dressed in mourning white, walking or riding according to their rank and health. The new emperor would be prominent, visible to all ever, demonstrating filial piety through his public grief. Other family members would follow in prescribed order, everyone performing their role in this final ceremony. Officials came next, ranked by position, some having traveled from distant provinces to participate, Foreign dignitaries joined, representatives from tributary states and allied kingdoms, all demonstrating respect for the deceased and political awareness of the succession. The rear guard closed the procession, more soldiers ensuring no one disrupted the solemnity from behind. The procession moved slowly, agonizingly slowly, a few miles per day, because rushing death's journey was disrespectful. Commoners along the route were required to prostrate themselves as it passed. Entire villages face down in the dirt as the emperor made his final trip across their land. Villages would be evacuated if they were directly on the route, because having people's daily lives intersect with imperial death was cosmically inappropriate. The displaced villagers would watch from a distance, seeing their homes temporarily occupied by an event they'd remember for generations. Way stations were established every few miles, places where the procession could rest overnight. These weren't simple camps. They were temporary palaces, built specifically for this funeral, used for a single night, and then abandoned. The waste was spectacular. But waste was the point, demonstrating that the empire could afford to build palaces for one night's use, showed power that transcended practical considerations. For the participants, the procession was exhausting. Bearers carrying the coffin worked in shifts. But even with rotation, the physical toll was enormous. Musicians played until their lips bled. Monks chanted until their voices broke. Officials walked until their feet blistered inside silk shoes never designed for distance. And this went on for days, sometimes weeks, if the tomb was particularly distant. The summer heat was unbearable. The winter cold was bitter. And neither season offered respite from the relentless forward movement. The world's slowest, saddest parade, marathon morning, an Olympic sport they didn't include. Nothing says rest in peace like dragging a body 100 miles in elaborate ceremony. But the journey mattered. In Chinese philosophy, the path was as important as the destination. The procession wasn't just moving a body. It was providing one final opportunity for the empire to acknowledge its ruler, to participate collectively in the transition, to transform individual death into communal memory. When the procession finally reached the tomb site, the final ceremonies would begin. The tomb entrance was enormous. A doorway into the earth, large enough to swallow the coffin. The treasures, the offerings, and the ambitions of everyone present. The descent into the tomb was carefully choreographed. The coffin would be lowered on ramps or carried downstairs, carved into stone, moving from the world of light into the world of darkness, from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead. The tomb's interior was staggering. Multiple chambers, each one larger than most houses, all connected by passages carved through solid rock. The main burial chamber was at the center, its location calculated by geomancy to ensure optimal cosmic energy. The coffin would be placed precisely, coordinates determined by astronomical calculations and religious consultation. Around the coffin, treasures would be arranged: gold and jade, silk and pottery, weapons and art. Everything the emperor had valued in life and might need in death. Not everything. Obviously, you can't bury a palace, but representative samples, carefully selected to provide comfort and demonstrate status. In early dynasties, the treasures included people, servants, concubines, guards, all killed to accompany the emperor into the afterlife. The living would be sealed in the tomb, their screams fading as the stone doors closed. Their deaths, ensuring the emperor wouldn't be lonely in eternity. It's horrifying to modern sensibilities. This practice of human sacrifice disguised as loyalty, but in the worldview that justified it, death wasn't ending so much as transition. Those sealed in the tomb weren't being killed, but were continuing their service in a different realm. Small comfort when you're suffocating in darkness. But that was the logic. Later, dynasties replaced human sacrifice with effigies, clay figures and paintings representing servants and guards. Progress. Definitely. Though it suggests earlier, emperors questioned whether painted servants could really provide useful service in the afterlife. The sealing ceremony was the final ritual. Enormous stone doors, weighing tons, would be rolled into place. Multiple doors. Actually, each one adding another layer of protection against tomb robbers. Locks would be engaged, ceremonial and actual, creating barriers that were supposed to last for eternity. Outside, guards would be posted, their duty to protect the tomb forever. In reality, forever usually meant a few generations until the dynasty changed and the new rulers stopped funding tomb security. But the intention was permanent protection, watching in perpetuity against those who would disturb the emperor's rest for profit. The tomb was never meant to be opened. Sealing. It was sealing that chapter of history, transforming a person into memory, a reign into past tense, a life into legend. With the burial complete, the official mourning period began, and it was extensive. 3 years was the traditional period for mourning a parent, and the emperor was the father of the nation. So, 3 years of varying levels of grief became mandatory. The first 100 days were the strictest, intense restrictions on music, entertainment, and celebration. Officials who'd been promoted just before the emperor's death had to wait to assume their new positions. Examinations were postponed. Weddings were delayed. The empire held its breath, collectively acknowledging loss. The first year maintained serious restrictions, gradually loosening as time passed. By the second year, life was returning to normal, though certain observances continued. By the third year, the mourning was mostly symbolic, remembered on anniversaries, but not dominating daily life. For the imperial family, particularly the new emperor, the mourning period was complicated. You had to rule while grieving, project authority while performing filial piety, govern an empire while theoretically being too distraught to think about governance. The heir, now emperor during mourning, faced impossible expectations. Show too much grief, and you seemed weak. Show too little, and you seemed unfilial. The balance required was inhuman. But then again, so was most of what being emperor required. Widows and consorts entered a different kind of mourning, one that might last the rest of their lives. Confined to the palace, wearing white, increasingly forgotten as the new reign established its own court, its own favorites, its own priorities. Their mourning was less about grief and more about obsolescence, slowly fading from relevance, while technically still alive. Ancestor tablets were installed in the imperial temple, physical representations of the deceased emperor's spirit. Daily offerings would be made, incense burned, prayers spoken. The dead emperor became an ancestor, joining the ranks of previous rulers who watched over the dynasty from beyond death. Annual commemorations would be held at the tomb site, officials making pilgrimages to pay respects and maintain the fiction that the dead were merely away, not gone. These rituals would continue for generations if the dynasty lasted. creating a chain of memory connecting past and future. The imperial funeral was the final proof that in China, even death was performance. Months of planning, weeks of ritual, years of mourning, all to ensure that one man's passing was felt by millions. To Western eyes, it might seem excessive, even morbid, but that misses the point entirely. The funeral wasn't about death. It was about connection. Connection between past and present, between living and dead, between the individual and the cosmos itself. Every bell that rang, every monk that chanted, every official that prostrated was saying the same thing. You mattered. Your life had meaning. Your death leaves a void. In a way, the elaborate funeral was the empire's way of processing grief. When millions share the same rituals, individual sadness becomes collective memory. Private loss transforms into public history. The pain doesn't disappear, but it becomes bearable through shared experience. The tombs are still there, silent under Chinese mountains. Some have been opened by archaeologists, revealing treasures that take your breath away and tragedies that break your heart. Terracotta armies standing guard for emperors who've been dust for millennia. Gold and jade, untouched for centuries. And sometimes, skeletons of servants who died, so their master wouldn't journey alone. Other tombs remain sealed, keeping their secrets. Modern technology could open them, could reveal what's inside. But sometimes the decision is made to leave them undisturbed. Not from superstition, though the idea of tomb curses persists, but from respect. Let the dead rest. Let their treasures remain theirs. Let some mysteries stay mysterious. But whether opened or closed, they all tell the same story. Humanity will always struggle with death. We'll dress it up, ritualize it, make it beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Because the alternative, accepting that we simply end, is too terrible to bear. So we build tombs like palaces. We mourn for years. We seal coffins with ceremony and prayers and tears, not because it brings anyone back, but because it makes the unbearable just barely bearable, because it transforms individual death into collective meaning, because it proves that some things matter enough to warrant impossible effort. The emperor is gone. The dynasties have fallen. The Forbidden City is a museum, but the rituals remain, echoing through time, proving that some performances outlive the performers themselves. In the end, the imperial funeral taught a lesson that transcends culture and era. We don't build elaborate death rituals for the dead. They're past caring. We build them for the living, for those who remain and must find a way to continue existing in a world that's been irrevocably changed by absence. The ceremony doesn't ease the pain. Nothing does. But it gives the pain structure, meaning, a path through grief that's been walked by millions before. And sometimes, that's enough. Sleep now. Rest easy. And be grateful that when your time comes, whenever that may be, you probably won't require decades of tomb construction, weeks of funeral procession, and years of mandatory mourning. Your funeral will be simpler, shorter, and infinitely more private. But maybe, just maybe, there's something to be said for a world that treated death with such elaborate respect. That said, through ceremony and sacrifice and impossible effort, you lived. We witnessed it. Your absence matters. The tombs stand silent. The dynasties are memory, but the message remains, carved in stone and written in ritual. Every ending deserves acknowledgement. Every life, no matter how it ends, deserves a proper goodbye. And in that final ceremony, as in all the ceremonies that came before, the point was never efficiency or practicality. The point was meaning, creating it where none naturally exists, imposing order on chaos, making death into something other than simple cessation. Did they succeed? The tombs remain. The stories persist. The rituals echo through centuries. You're thinking about them now, millennia later, wondering about emperors you'll never meet and ceremonies you'll never witness. Maybe that's the real immortality. Not the tombs or treasures, but the stories that survive them, the memory of elaborate grief, performed perfectly, remembered forever. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember somewhere in history, un empereur died, un empire mourd, and the world kept turning, forever changed by absence, but continuing, nonetheless. That's the final lesson of the imperial funeral. Life continues. It always does. But how we mark the endings, how we honor what's lost, how we create meaning from mortality, that's what separates us from the animals and connects us to something larger than ourselves. Good night, rest, and may your ending, whenever it comes, be marked with at least a fraction of the care, ceremony, and cosmic consideration given to those long-dead emperors whose tombs still stand, silent witnesses to humanity's eternal struggle with death.